At the Christmas party, my father's hand came down across my face so fast the sound of it cut through the music and the laughter. And for a second, the whole room went silent before the chatter started again, awkward and forced. My cheek burned. My ears rang, but what stung more was the sight of my mother, sitting just a few feet away in her sequined dress, tilting her head back and laughing like it was part of the entertainment. 20 people saw it. 20 people saw my mother laugh at me while my father slapped me. And I stood there frozen, humiliated, trying to swallow the knot in my throat. I told myself not to cry. I told myself I would not give them that satisfaction. But deep down, something cracked. They thought I'd stay quiet, like always. They thought I'd keep the family secret. They had no idea that within an hour, I would make a call that would change everything, a call I'd been thinking about for months but never dared to actually place. Until that night. I stood there with the taste of blood at the corner of my lip, pretending to adjust my hair so no one would notice my shaking hands. My cousins whispered behind their wine glasses. My uncle cleared his throat and tried to smooth it over with a joke, and my father strutted back to his chair as if he'd just corrected me like some unruly child. That was his favorite narrative. That I was dramatic, spoiled, too sensitive. He had been doing this for years, cutting me down in public, but never with such force, never with 20 witnesses and a mother who chose laughter over protection. I excused myself to the kitchen, blaming the punch bowl, but really I needed a wall to lean on before my legs gave out. I pressed my cheek against the cold refrigerator door, eyes burning, and I heard my mother's laugh echo from the living room again. That sound sealed it. All the time she told me, "Don't provoke him," or "Just let it go, he's your father," rushed through my head, and I realized she wasn't just complicit. She was entertained. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I looked at the screen, saw the number I had saved but never dialed. My finger hovered, my pulse hammering in my ears. Tonight, the humiliation had gone too far. Tonight, I was done being the family's quiet scapegoat. I stepped out the back door into the cold December air and pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before a calm voice picked up on the other end, and I whispered quickly, afraid my words would dissolve if I hesitated. I gave my name, the address, and told them it wasn't the first time, but it was the first time this many people had seen it. My breath fogged in the night air, my dress offering no protection from the December chill. But I didn't care. The cold steadied me. I had thought about this moment so many times before, filing a report, making someone in authority listen. But I had always pulled back, afraid of tearing the family apart, afraid of what people would say, afraid of being labeled the ungrateful daughter. Yet that slap, delivered like a show for an audience, broke something inside me that could never be repaired. As I spoke, I felt a strange calm settle over me, like the decision had already been made long ago, and tonight was simply the moment it came to life. When I hung up, I leaned against the brick wall of the house and listened to the muffled laughter and clinking glasses inside, wondering how long it would take before the knock on the door came. I could see the window from where I stood, my father holding court with a whiskey in hand, my mother still smiling as if nothing had happened. They had no idea what was coming. Memories started to flood me. Birthdays where he drank too much and mocked me for my grades, dinners where my mother pretended not to hear his insults, the countless times I was told to keep it in the family. I realized I had been groomed into silence, into playing my role as the problem child, while my sister was showered with praise for doing nothing more than existing. It had always been me who absorbed the blows, the sarcasm, the guilt trips. But tonight, I wasn't absorbing anything. I was redirecting it. When I walked back inside, my face composed. My father smirked at me like he had won. My mother gave me that condescending look of, "Don't ruin the party." I sat down, poured myself a glass of water, and said nothing. The secret was already in motion. All I had to do now was wait. Minutes passed, maybe 20, maybe less, though every second dragged like an hour as I sat there in that overheated living room, the scent of pine needles from the Christmas tree mixing with the sharp tang of whiskey that clung to my father's breath. He was telling some exaggerated story about work, his friends nodding along as if he were some great man instead of the bully they had just witnessed. And my mother leaned close to him, her hand on his arm, as though to reassure the crowd that Everything was fine. It was a performance they had perfected for years. The powerful patriarch, the loyal wife, the daughter cast as a troublesome inconvenience. I sipped my water slowly, my cheeks still throbbing, watching them like an outsider, like a guest in a family that was supposed to be mine. Every detail etched itself into my mind. The blinking red and green lights on the tree reflecting off the window, the hum of holiday music looping endlessly, my cousin nervously stirring his drink without drinking it, the way people avoided my eyes but couldn't stop sneaking glances at me. They all knew, and yet not one person had stood up for me. That realization hardened something in me. They weren't just passive witnesses. They were part of the silence that kept my father untouchable. When the doorbell finally rang, the room went still in an instant. My father barked out a laugh, thinking it was a late guest, and my mother went to open it with her practiced hostess smile. But when two officers stepped into the doorway, their badges catching the light, you could feel the shift in the air, like a balloon suddenly punctured. My father's laugh faltered, his hand tightening around his glass. And my mother's face, drained of color. I stayed seated, hands folded calmly in my lap, while everyone else froze. The officers asked for my name, and when I stood, my father tried to interrupt, booming about family business and overreacting. But the officers didn't look at him. They looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I felt seen. I spoke clearly, my voice steady, recounting what had happened not just tonight but before. Not in detail, not yet, but enough that the officers exchanged a glance that said everything I needed. My father's face turned red, not from shame, but from fury that he couldn't control the narrative. My mother reached for my arm, whispering harshly, "What are you doing? Do you know what you've started?" And I pulled away, louder this time. "Yes, I do." You could hear the collective gasp from the room, like the air itself had shifted. Sides. My father shouted about disrespect, about ruining Christmas, about embarrassing him in front of everyone, but his voice sounded smaller now, hollow against the calm authority of the uniforms standing in our doorway. For once, he wasn't the loudest presence in the room. For once, he wasn't in control. And as the questions continued, as the attention shifted to me instead of him, I realized that the secret call I had made wasn't just about tonight. It was about breaking years of silence, about forcing the truth into the open, no matter how messy or inconvenient it was for the family's polished image. I sat back down, the hum of whispered shock filling the air, and I felt something strange and powerful wash over me. I wasn't scared anymore. Not of him, not of her, not of the silence. Tonight was only the beginning. The officers stepped further, into the house, their presence cutting through the false cheer like a knife through tinsel. My father stood, puffing his chest, demanding to know who had called them, as though the answer weren't already obvious. I kept my gaze steady, meeting his eyes across the room, and for the first time, I didn't flinch. "I did," I said, my voice carrying louder than the carols still playing faintly from the Bluetooth speaker. My mother gasped, her hand flying. To her chest, her eyes darting around to see who had heard me. Everyone had. The guests sat frozen, caught between curiosity and discomfort, unsure whether to slip out quietly or pretend loyalty to the host. One of the officers asked if we could speak privately, but my father barked that no daughter of his was going to air dirty laundry in front of strangers. The officer turned to him calmly. "Sir, we're not asking. We're here to make sure she's safe." The silence that followed was deafening. My father's jaw clenched, his nostrils flared, and I saw in his eyes that if the uniforms hadn't been standing there, he might have raised his hand again right then. My mother tugged at his arm, whispering something sharp, but he shook her off, his pride too swollen to recognize the ground crumbling beneath him. The officers led me toward the hallway, away from the blinking lights and stairs, and asked if I wanted to file a formal report. My heart pounded so loud I thought they could hear it, but my voice was clear when I said, "Yes." It was a single word, but it felt like cutting a chain that had been welded around me for years. They handed me a clipboard, and as I began to write, my father's voice roared from the living room, full of threats and self-righteousness. "This is ridiculous! She's just looking for attention. You people should be out catching real criminals, not barging into a family Christmas to be. His words spilled over each other, desperate, angry, but they sounded weaker than ever, hollow against the steady scratch of my pen on paper. I wrote down dates, incidents, details that had lived only in my memory until now. The time he shoved me into a wall when I was 14. The time he grabbed my wrist so hard I couldn't move it for days. The insults hurled in front of family, the gaslighting afterward, the silence from my mother who told me to forgive, to move on, to stop exaggerating. Every line I wrote felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, a piece he had tried to erase. When I handed the clipboard back, the officer gave me a small nod, like he understood more than his job required. They explained the next steps, that there would be follow-up, that my father might face consequences he'd never imagined possible. I could hear my relatives murmuring, some defending him, others too cowardly to speak. My mother hovered in the doorway, her face a mixture of fear and calculation, already thinking of what story she'd spin for the neighbors, for the church, for anyone who dared to ask. But no spin could undo what had just been written down, signed and witnessed. No laugh could erase the sound of that slap, echoed by 20 silent witnesses. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like prey. I felt like the one holding the truth, and the truth was heavier than his pride. When the officers stepped back into the living room, my father tried to tower over them, insisting they leave, that this was nothing more than family discipline, his favorite phrase. But the taller officer squared his shoulders and said firmly, "Sir, lay one more hand on her or interfere with this process, and you will be spending Christmas Eve in custody." The words hit him harder than any slap he'd Tawabi Mead had ever given me. His face twisted, red with rage, but he sank back into his chair, gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles went white. My mother rushed to his side, whispering frantically, as though she could still salvage the image of a perfect holiday. I stood by the officers, and for the first time in my life, I felt the power dynamic in that house tilt away from him. My relatives sat in stunned silence, their forks idle, drinks untouched, watching the unraveling of a man who had ruled them through intimidation for decades. The officer asked if I had somewhere safe to go, someone I could trust. For a moment, panic washed over me. Years of isolation had left me believing I had no one. But then I remembered a friend who had always said, "Call me if it ever gets bad." I had never taken her up on it, too ashamed, too trapped. Tonight that shame was gone. I gave her name, and one of the officers offered to wait with me until she arrived. My father shouted that I was humiliating him, that I'd regret this, that no daughter of his would defy him like this. I turned to him, my voice steady, louder than I expected. "I am not your punching bag. Not anymore." You could feel the electricity in the room when I said it, like everyone finally heard the truth they had been pretending not to know. My father went silent, stunned that his control was slipping. My mother's eyes darted between us, as if she couldn't decide whether to scold me or plead with me to stop. But I didn't stop. I looked around the room at the aunts, uncles, cousins who had watched me grow up under his shadow. You all saw it. You've seen it before, and every time you looked away. The weight of my words sank into the silence, and no one could meet my eyes. Shame spread across their faces, but I didn't need their defense anymore. I wasn't asking them to pick sides. I was done playing that game. The doorbell rang again, and when my friend appeared, her face pale, but determined, I felt the last thread of fear snap. She hugged me tightly, shielding me with her body as though daring my father to try and touch me again. The officers made it clear I was leaving, and if anyone tried to stop me, there would be consequences. I walked out of that house with my head high, the cold air burning my lungs, but each step lighter than the last. Behind me, I could still hear my father shouting, my mother crying, my relatives buzzing with gossip and fear. But for the first time in my life, none of that chained me anymore. The house that had always felt like a prison was shrinking behind me, and I knew that the call I had made tonight wasn't just a report. It was the beginning of my freedom. The car ride with my friend felt unreal, like I was watching my own life play out from a distance, headlights slicing through the dark December streets while my body sat trembling in the passenger seat. She kept glancing over at me, her hand brushing, mine whispering, "You're safe now. You did the right thing." But the weight of years pressed down on me, and I could still hear his voice echoing in my ears, threatening, belittling, swearing I'd regret standing up to him. My phone buzzed nonstop in my bag. Messages from my mother, from cousins, from numbers I didn't even recognize. I didn't look. I couldn't. I knew what they would say before even reading them. Accusations, pleas to drop it, warnings that I was tearing the family apart. But hadn't it been torn long ago, ripped open by violence and silence and laughter at my pain? I thought of my mother's face, lit with amusement while I stood humiliated, and I realized I couldn't let her rewrite the narrative this time. She would call it an overreaction. She would say I provoked him. She would polish the story until it gleamed like tinsel on a tree. But the officers had been there. The paperwork was filed. The truth was no longer confined to the four walls of that house. My friend drove me to her apartment, a small, warm space cluttered with books and the smell of cinnamon from a candle burning on the counter. She handed me a blanket, a mug of tea, and sat across from me until I found the words to explain everything. Not just tonight, but years of it. The slammed doors, the bruises, the names he called me, the way my mother had always chosen his side. I didn't cry as I told it. My voice was flat, almost clinical, like I was reading a report. But inside, every memory was a jagged shard, cutting through me as I spoke. When I finished, my friend reached for my hand again and said, "You are never going back there, not alone." Something in me broke then, not from pain, but from the unfamiliar feeling of being believed, of being protected. The next morning, my phone was full of messages. My mother begging me to reconsider, my father sending walls of angry texts, relatives urging me to keep the family together. I ignored them all. Instead, I called the officer who had given me his card, and I asked what came next. He explained there would be an investigation, that charges could be pressed, that I had options. For once, options that were mine to choose. I hung up, sat in silence, and realized the slap at that Christmas party had been the last one he would ever give me. They thought their laughter, their silence, would keep me small forever, but all it did was give me the courage to finally say, enough. In the days that followed, the fallout rippled through every corner of my family, like a storm tearing through fragile decorations left too long in the attic. My father raged, calling every relative, spinning his version of events, that I was unstable, that I'd ruined Christmas, that I was trying to destroy him out of spite. My mother backed him, of course, her voice trembling as she begged people to pray for us and to help her daughter see reason. But something had shifted that they hadn't expected. People had seen it with their own eyes. The cousins who had laughed nervously, the uncles who tried to look away, even the aunts who whispered in the kitchen. None of them could deny what had happened. Not this time. The silence that had protected him for years was crumbling. I started receiving quiet messages from relatives I hadn't spoken to in ages, some apologizing, some admitting they had seen too much over the years and never spoken up. Their words didn't erase the hurt, but they were proof that the facade was cracking. Meanwhile, the investigation moved forward. The officers contacted me for more details, and I provided them with everything. Text messages where he'd berated me, old photographs where bruises peeked from beneath long sleeves, even a voicemail where his drunken voice slurred threats I'd saved but never dared to use. Every piece of evidence was like another nail in the coffin of his untouchable image. My father tried intimidation next, sending messages that swung wildly between threats and manipulative apologies. "You'll regret this when I'm gone. You're destroying your own family. No one will ever forgive you." But the difference now was that his words no longer landed the way they used to. They didn't sink into me like poison. They bounced off, powerless against the shield I had finally built. My mother's messages hurt in a different way. Her pleas, her guilt trips, her insistence that I was killing her by going through with this. But even those began to feel hollow, like echoes of the same lines she had repeated for years. One night, sitting in my friend's apartment, wrapped in a blanket with the city lights outside, I realized I wasn't afraid of them anymore. Not of his temper, not of her silence, not of the judgment of people who had let this go on for too long. I had made the secret call that broke everything open, and there was no going back. The family I thought I had was gone, but maybe it had never truly existed in the first place. What lay ahead was terrifying. Legal battles, estrangement, the possibility of being completely cut off. But it was also the first time in my life that the future felt like mine to claim. Weeks turned into months, and the investigation gathered momentum in ways my father could no longer control. The slap at the Christmas party was only the spark. Once the officers dug deeper, the fire spread into every corner of his carefully constructed reputation. Old reports surfaced from neighbors who had heard things, but never followed through. A former colleague came forward about his temper at work, whispering to investigators what he had always been too scared to say. My mother clung to him, tighter than ever, parading herself as the loyal wife, crying to anyone who would listen that I was being manipulated, that I was sick, that no daughter would betray her family like this unless she had been poisoned by outsiders. But even her performance cracked when some of my cousins were subpoenaed as witnesses. They had seen it. They had no choice but to tell the truth. And once they did, the silence that had held my father's power together shattered for good. Remember sitting in the courtroom months later, my palms sweaty, my heart pounding, while he sat across the aisle in a suit that suddenly looked too big for him. His smirk was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped scowl as the charges were read. The judge's voice echoed through the chamber. Domestic assault, battery, endangerment. Words I had carried inside me for years now spoken aloud, in front of strangers, carved into the record where they could never be erased. My mother stared straight ahead, her eyes glassy, her hands twisting in her lap. She didn't look at me once. I didn't expect her to. When I took the stand, I told the truth without shaking. I described that night, the slap, the laughter, the years that had led up to it. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. My voice was steady, clipped, every word deliberate, like laying bricks one by one until the wall was unbreakable. My father's lawyer tried to paint me as dramatic, emotional, unstable, but the evidence, the witnesses, the photographs, the recordings, all drowned his attempts in hard fact. When the verdict came, it wasn't everything I had dreamed of, but it was enough. Probation, mandated counseling, community service, a record that would follow him forever. No longer the untouchable patriarch, no longer able to hide behind charm and intimidation. For the first time, he was accountable. And though some family members cut me off completely, whispering about betrayal, others reached out quietly, admitting they had wished for years someone would break the cycle. I wasn't a villain. I wasn't crazy. I was the first one to stand up and say enough. Walking out of that courthouse into the bright afternoon, I felt the weight of generations lift from my shoulders. My mother refused to speak to me afterward, her silence louder than any scream. But I realized then that I no longer needed her approval. I no longer needed any of them to validate my pain. I had already validated it myself. The secret call that night had set everything in motion, and it had saved me. And though the scars remained, both visible and hidden, they were no longer marks of shame. They were proof that I had survived, proof that I had finally chosen myself over their silence. After the sentencing, the weight of it all hit me in waves. My father, once the man who commanded every room, now had a record that followed him like a shadow. The news spread quickly. Coworkers whispered, neighbors avoided eye contact, and even the relatives who once defended him spoke his name with lowered voices. My mother withdrew further, refusing to accept what had happened, insisting to anyone who would listen that I had exaggerated, that the judge had been biased, that the world was out to humiliate their family. But her words no longer carried the authority they once did. People had seen. People had testified. And the truth had already taken root. For me, life began to move in small, unexpected ways. I got my own place, nothing fancy, just a one-bedroom apartment with creaky floors and thin walls. But it was mine. I bought a couch in a color I liked, something my father would have called ridiculous. And every time I sat on it, I reminded myself that no one else had the right to decide what belonged in my home. Therapy became a lifeline, helping me untangle years of gaslighting and silence. For the first time, I said out loud that what happened to me was abuse, and instead of being dismissed, I was met with validation. Each session felt like pulling weeds from a garden that had been overgrown for decades. Painful, but necessary. I started reconnecting with parts of myself I'd buried long ago, sketching, jogging at sunrise, cooking meals without hearing criticism in the back of my mind. And slowly, I began to imagine a future that wasn't defined by fear. Still, the nights were the hardest. Sometimes I would wake up from dreams where his voice still shouted, where my mother still laughed, and I'd have to remind myself that it was over, that the past couldn't reach me anymore. The scars weren't gone, but they were no longer. Chains. They were reminders that I had survived. What surprised me most was the quiet messages that came from unexpected people. Neighbors who had once turned away now saying, "I'm glad you spoke up," or coworkers slipping me notes of support. One cousin, who had been silent that night at the party, confessed that my courage had inspired her to leave her own toxic relationship. That was when I realized the ripple effect of what I had done. By breaking the silence, I hadn't just freed myself, I had shown others that it was possible. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, one thing was clear. I would never again be the girl standing in a crowded room, slapped and laughed at, holding back tears in silence. I was someone else now. Someone stronger, someone unafraid, to be heard. My mother tried one last time to pull me back. She showed up outside my apartment uninvited, clutching a tin of Christmas cookies as if nostalgia could erase years of bruises and silence. She knocked for nearly an hour, her voice swinging between desperate begging and sharp accusations. One moment pleading, "Please, just open the door, we can fix this." And the next spitting, "You're destroying your own family. You're killing me with this betrayal." I sat in the dark with the lights off, listening to her every word, my chest tight, but I didn't move. The girl I used to be would have opened that door, desperate for scraps of her approval, desperate for some sign that she cared. But I wasn't that girl anymore. Eventually, her knocking stopped, and the hallway went silent. I stayed there, still as stone, until I heard her footsteps fade away. And in that silence, I knew something had shifted forever. I had finally chosen myself, even if it meant closing the door on her for good. In the weeks that followed, I started to rebuild. Piece by piece, I picked up extra shifts at work, not to prove my worth, but to fund the stability that no one could take from me. I found secondhand furniture, mismatched but full of life, and painted the walls of my apartment a warm color that my father would have mocked. Every brushstroke felt like reclaiming space he had stolen from me. Nights were still hard. Dreams, where his voice thundered and my mother laughed, would jolt me awake. But when I opened my eyes, I remembered I was safe now. The nightmare was behind me. I began writing everything down, not just for the case or therapy, but for myself. Every hidden memory, insult and bruise, every time I had been told to keep the peace spilled out onto the page, and with each line I felt lighter. For the first time, the story wasn't theirs to control. It was mine. Some relatives cut me off entirely, claiming I had ruined the family name, but others began calling in secret. Their voices shook as they admitted things I never expected to hear. "I'm sorry I stayed silent. I wish I'd spoken up years ago." One cousin told me she left her husband after seeing what I had done. Another whispered that she finally believed she could tell her own story. That was when I realized the secret call I made that night wasn't just about freeing myself. It had planted a seed in others, showing them that silence could be broken. That fear didn't have to last forever. I wasn't just rebuilding my life. I was opening a crack in theirs too. Spring came, and with it a strange sense of distance from the night that had once defined me. The Christmas party felt like another lifetime, as though the slap, the laughter, the knock on the door belonged to someone else's story. But the ripple effects kept unfolding. My father's presence in the community was no longer untouchable. People whispered behind his back instead of toasting him. Some avoided him entirely. The invitations that once poured in dried up, and his pride, the thing he valued most, was bruised in ways he couldn't conceal. My mother clung harder to her narrative, insisting to anyone who asked that I was unstable, that I had betrayed them. But the more she tried to convince others, the more obvious it became that she was spinning lies to protect him. For the first time in my life, I felt no need to argue, no urge to defend myself. The truth was already out there, written in reports and witnessed in court, impossible to bury again. I focused on the small victories. the morning sun spilling. Into my little apartment, the laughter I shared with coworkers who became friends, the quiet pride of paying my own bills without hearing anyone criticize how I spent my money. I signed up for a class, something simple, painting, and each brushstroke felt like reclaiming pieces of myself I'd abandoned. I found myself smiling more, not the tight, polite smile I used to wear at family gatherings, but a real one that reached my eyes. And though nightmares still came sometimes, jolting me awake in the dark, I no longer felt trapped by them. Summer heat replaced the chill of that winter night, and by then, my life felt almost unrecognizable compared to the girl who once stood trembling in front of a Christmas tree, cheek burning, ears ringing with the sound of her own mother's laughter. My apartment had begun to look like a home, filled with mismatched furniture that somehow suited me perfectly. Bright plants on the windowsill, and the hum of quiet peace I had never known before. I was no longer counting the days by court hearings, or phone calls filled with venom. Instead, I marked time by the smell of fresh paint, the feel of sunlight through sheer curtains, the sound of my own laughter that didn't carry fear inside it. Of course, the past still tried to pull me back. My father sent letters through other relatives, carefully worded to sound like apologies, but laced with bitterness. We should put this behind us. Family is all we have. You've made your point. My mother's silence was louder than his words. She didn't call, didn't write, not once. At first, that absence pierced me, but eventually I realized it was just another performance. Her refusal to acknowledge me unless I bent back into the role she needed me to play. And I would never play it again. One evening, I attended a small gathering at a coworker's apartment. Nothing special, just pizza boxes on the table and music playing softly. But when I looked around the room and realized I was laughing, really laughing, surrounded by people who saw me not as a burden or a scapegoat, but as someone worth knowing, I felt a lump rise in my throat. I excused myself to the balcony, breathing, in the warm night air, and for the first time, I let myself cry. Not tears of shame, not of fear, but of relief. Relief that I had survived. Relief that the call I made that night had ripped me out of a life that would have destroyed me if I had stayed. Later that summer, I started volunteering at a local shelter. I didn't plan it. I just walked in one afternoon and asked if they needed help. Listening to other women share their stories, watching them take their first steps toward safety, I saw my own reflection in their eyes. I realized then that my voice could be more than survival. It could be strength for someone else. And for the first time in a long time, I felt proud. Proud of the bruises that had faded but left lessons. Proud of the scars that told the truth. Proud of the girl who had once picked up the phone in the dead of night and decided to change her story forever. I knew my family would never welcome me back. Not in the way I once longed for, but I also knew I no longer wanted that seat at their table. My life was no longer defined by their laughter or their silence. It was defined by the choice I had made, the secret call that freed me, and the life I was building in its wake. Autumn arrived, and with it came a quiet steadiness I had never experienced before. The world didn't feel like it was holding its breath around me anymore. I woke up to cool mornings, brewed my own coffee, and walked through the city streets without fear of running into him or her. My father was a ghost of the man he once pretended to be, reduced to whispers in a community that no longer respected him. My mother remained silent, her absence like a locked door I no longer wanted to open. And though a part of me still grieved, the family I wished I'd had, I finally understood that grieving was not the same as longing to return. By then, the case was no longer fresh news, but its effects lingered. At work, people treated me differently. Not with pity, but with a subtle respect. Like they knew I had walked through fire and come out the other side. My landlord, who had once eyed me with suspicion when I moved in alone, now greeted me, warmly, sometimes slipping extra minutes on the laundry machine without charge. It was these small, ordinary kindnesses that reminded me I had built something my father could never destroy. A life free from his shadow. I also began to reclaim holidays for myself. When December rolled around again, I refused to let Christmas belong to that night of violence. I bought a small tree, decorated it with ornaments I chose, and invited a handful of friends over. We ate, we laughed, We clinked glasses, and for the first time in my life, I felt what the season was supposed to mean. Not fear of a drunken outburst, not bracing for the sting of words or hands, but warmth, community, and peace. My friend, the one who had answered my call and opened her apartment to me, stood by the window with a smile and whispered, "Look how far you've come." I followed her gaze to the room filled with light and realized she was right. The nightmares didn't vanish completely. Sometimes I still woke to the echo of his voice, or the memory of my mother's laugh, sharp and cruel. But now, when the dreams came, I had tools to fight them. I had a notebook by my bed where I wrote down the truth to ground myself, proof that I was no longer trapped. And every morning after, I rose stronger for having faced the shadows again. That was when it hit me fully. The secret call I made wasn't just an act of desperation. It was the hinge on which my whole life turned. It didn't just expose my father or silence my mother's laugh. It gave me the chance to exist beyond them, to live not as their scapegoat, not as their shame, but as myself. And those scars don't fade overnight. They had become part of the map of who I was, a woman who had finally broken the cycle and built a life of her own making. By the time the leaves had fallen for the second autumn since that night, I realized I had crossed a line I could never go back from, and I didn't want to. The version of me who once begged for scraps of my mother's attention, who flinched at the sound of my father's voice, who silenced herself at family gatherings, was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone who had walked through humiliation and violence and chosen, finally, to save herself. My parents remained distant shadows. My father's pride had curdled into bitterness, his circle of admirers reduced to a handful of enablers who clung to him out of habit more than loyalty. My mother, I heard through whispers, still told anyone who would listen that I had been brainwashed, that I had exaggerated, that I had destroyed the family for attention. But the more she repeated it, the more it revealed about her, not me. And I found that I no longer felt the sting of her denial. It was just another story she told to shield herself from the truth she couldn't face. My life had grown into something I could never have imagined. I had new traditions, new friendships, a home that felt safe, and a voice that no longer trembled when I used it. The memories of that night still lived inside me, but not as chains, as markers of the turning point, proof of what I had survived. I spoke at a support group one evening, sharing my story for the first time to a room full of strangers who nodded with tears in their eyes. And as I watched them, I realized the secret call I had made that night had never really been secret, at all. It was a declaration, a breaking of silence that had echoed outward, touching lives I hadn't even known were listening. And that became my quiet revenge, not in screaming, not in proving my parents wrong, not in dragging them into more courts or more confrontations, but in living a life they could never imagine for me, a life of freedom, of laughter, of chosen family, of dignity. Every breath I took without fear was an act of defiance. Every smile I allowed myself was a rebellion. And though I sometimes still felt the ache of what I had lost, I understood at last that it was not me who had destroyed the family. They had destroyed it with violence and silence. I had simply refused to keep carrying the ruins. When I look back now, I don't see the girl who was slapped at a Christmas party and laughed at by her own mother. I see the woman who picked up the phone, who made the call, who rewrote her story in the middle of the night. And I know with every fiber of my being, that was the moment I saved my own life. And so, this became my ending. Not the neat kind where everyone apologizes, not the fairy tale where my parents suddenly realize what they've done and come running back with open arms. No, my father still carries his bitterness like a shield. My mother still tells her lies to anyone who will listen. And the relatives, who once laughed in silence, still avert their eyes when my name comes up. But I don't need them anymore. I stopped needing them the moment I chose myself over their silence. The true revenge wasn't in the charges or the court record, though those stripped him of the untouchable mask he once wore. The true revenge was that I walked away, built a life outside of their control, and found peace they can never take from me. They wanted me small, ashamed, and invisible. Instead, I am louder, freer, and stronger than they ever imagined I could be. When I look back at that Christmas night, The slap, the laughter, the 20 witnesses who pretended it was nothing. I don't see my humiliation anymore. I see the spark that lit the fire. I see the moment I chose to stop being their scapegoat and start being my own savior. That call was my beginning, my freedom, my secret that turned into my strength. And if I had to do it all over again, I would. Because, in the end, I didn't just survive them, I outlived the version of me they tried so hard to destroy. Tell me, would you have made the call too?